On the morning of August 29th, 2021, John Blair's world collapsed. What started as a routine visit to check on his daughter, Caitlin Blair, turned into a nightmare that would forever alter his life. Caitlin, a rising star on social media platforms, had recently moved into an apartment in Fort Bend County, Texas. She was known for her bold personality, confidence, and a growing online following, particularly on OnlyFans. At just 26 years old, Caitlin had managed to build a successful career as a dancer and model, capturing the attention of thousands with her vibrant content. Yet behind the facade of online fame, something much darker was unfolding. When John arrived at Caitlin's apartment, the door was unlocked. He entered cautiously, calling her name, but was met with silence. What he found inside was a scene of horror that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Lying on the floor of her living room was Caitlin's lifeless body, and next to her, the body of a man later identified as Mark Evans. Blood pooled around them, and the room bore the signs of a violent struggle. Both had suffered fatal wounds, though Caitlin's injuries were more brutal, suggesting a targeted attack. John immediately called 911, but by the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. The medical examiner later confirmed that Caitlin had died hours before her father's arrival, a victim of what appeared to be a murder-suicide. Mark Evans, a 32-year-old man from Florida, had taken his own life shortly after ending Caitlin's. It was a crime that would leave investigators and her grieving family with more questions than answers, as the details of Evans' obsession with Caitlin slowly came to light. From the outside, Caitlin Blair seemed to have everything. She was young, beautiful, and living a life that many of her followers envied. But the reality of her situation was much more complicated. Beneath the glamour of her online persona, Caitlin had been the target of relentless harassment, both from strangers and, as it turned out, from Evan, who had been following her closely for months. The extent of his obsession would only be uncovered after both their deaths, but even in the immediate aftermath, it was clear that this was not a random act of violence. The Fort Bend County Sheriff's Office launched an investigation into Caitlin's death, trying to piece together the events that led to the tragedy. Early reports revealed that Evans had been stalking Caitlin online, fixating on her social media accounts and her OnlyFans presence. He had traveled from Florida to Texas with the explicit intent of confronting her, though the exact trigger for his violent outburst remains a mystery. What is clear is that Evans' obsession had spiraled into a deadly delusion, one that Caitlin never saw coming. In the days following the discovery, the media descended on Fort Bend County, eager to uncover the details of Caitlin Blair's life and the circumstances surrounding her death. Headlines painted a picture of a promising young woman whose life was cut short by an unstable fan, and questions began to swirl about the risks associated with online fame. For Caitlin's family, however, the loss was deeply personal, and the media frenzy only added to their grief. John Blair, a quiet man who had always been protective of his daughter, was left devastated, struggling to comprehend how things had gone so horribly wrong. Before the tragedy, Caitlin Blair was on a steady rise toward stardom. Born and raised in Fort Bend County, Texas, she had always been drawn to the spotlight. From an early age, Caitlin had a magnetic presence. She excelled in dance, participating in local competitions and winning accolades for her performances. Her striking looks and natural charisma quickly led her to modeling, and by her early 20s, Caitlin was being approached by local agencies. But it wasn't until she ventured into the world of social media that her career truly took off. Caitlin's transition into online content creation began in her early 20s, just as platforms like Instagram and TikTok were becoming the go-to places for influencers and aspiring models. Her posts were a mix of fashion shoots, dance videos, and candid glimpses into her personal life. Her audience grew rapidly, drawn to her bold personality and her willingness to share intimate details about her life. It wasn't long before Caitlin made the decision to join OnlyFans, where she could monetize her content and interact more directly with her followers. OnlyFans provided Caitlin with a lucrative income, allowing her to live independently and focus entirely on her content creation. Her followers were mostly supportive, praising her confidence and her ability to embrace her sexuality on her own terms. But as her fame grew, so did the negative attention. Caitlin began receiving hateful messages and threats, something that unfortunately comes with the territory for many women in the public eye. She confided in friends and family about the harassment, but for the most part she brushed it off, determined not to let it affect her. Among the sea of admirers and trolls, however, one name stood out: Mark Evans. Caitlin had noticed Evans' increasingly obsessive behavior online, with him commenting on nearly every post she made, often inappropriately. His messages escalated over time, becoming more frequent and unsettling. Caitlin blocked him on several platforms, but Evans always found a way to resurface, creating new accounts to continue his pursuit. Despite these red flags, Caitlin did not report the harassment to authorities, assuming it was just another overzealous fan who would eventually lose interest. Behind the screen, Evans was becoming more unhinged. His obsession with Caitlin grew to the point where he believed he had a personal connection with her. He sent long, rambling messages professing his love and later his frustration at being ignored. Investigators would later find that Evans had been tracking Caitlin's movements for months, using her posts to figure out where she lived and who she spent time with. His descent into delusion was rapid, and by the summer of 2021, he had made the fateful decision to leave Florida and confront Caitlin in person. The intersection of Caitlin's growing fame and Evans' deteriorating mental state would set the stage for the deadly encounter in August. Despite her popularity, Caitlin was increasingly isolated, her personal life overshadowed by the demands of maintaining an online persona. She had begun to confide in friends about feeling overwhelmed, but she remained determined to push through, unaware that her biggest threat was lurking in the shadows, watching her every move. As the investigation into her death unfolded, Caitlin's family would grapple not only with their grief but also with the painful reality that her online fame had put her in harm's way. John Blair, devastated by the loss of his daughter, began speaking out about the dangers of social media, urging others to take the threats of stalkers and online harassers seriously. For him, Caitlin's death was not just a senseless tragedy but a cautionary tale about the perils of living in the public eye in an increasingly digital world. The initial shock of Caitlin Blair's death sent ripples through the community, but for the investigators tasked with unraveling the details, it marked the beginning of a long and complex journey. As the Fort Bend County Sheriff's Office combed through the crime scene, it became clear that this wasn't a random act of violence. The gruesome nature of the attack pointed towards something far more personal, a deep, festering obsession that had culminated in murder. Forensic teams meticulously gathered evidence from Caitlin's apartment, hoping to piece together the final moments of her life. Blood spatter analysis and the positions of the bodies told a grim story of a struggle that likely lasted minutes but felt like an eternity. Caitlin had fought back. Her injuries indicated defensive wounds, showing that she had tried to fend off Mark Evans in a desperate bid to survive. But Evans had overpowered her, leaving her battered and broken. After the assault, he turned the weapon on himself, ending his life in the same room where he had extinguished hers. While the physical evidence painted a picture of the crime, it was the digital trail left behind that would provide the most insight into Evans' deteriorating mind. Investigators gained access to Evans' phone and computer, uncovering hundreds of messages he had sent to Caitlin across multiple platforms. Many of these messages had gone unanswered, yet Evans continued to reach out, becoming more aggressive and erratic over time. He believed Caitlin owed him something: her attention, her affection, and when she didn't respond, his frustration turned into rage. Evans had also kept a disturbing journal, which investigators found in his car parked outside Caitlin's apartment. In it, he chronicled his growing obsession with her, detailing how he had followed her online for months and how he believed they were destined to be together. His entries became increasingly dark in the weeks leading up to the murder, revealing his plan to confront Caitlin and, if necessary, make her understand. The final entry, written just days before his trip to Texas, was chilling in its clarity. "If I can't have her, no one can." The journal and digital evidence made it clear that this was not a spontaneous crime. He had traveled over 1,000 miles from his home in Florida to confront Caitlin, driven by the belief that their relationship, imaginary as it was, could only end in one way. The investigation also revealed that Evans had a history of mental health issues, though he had never been formally diagnosed or treated. Friends and family from his hometown described him as quiet. As the details of the case unfolded, the media coverage intensified. Caitlin Blair, once known primarily for her beauty and online persona, was now being portrayed as a tragic victim of a broken system, one that failed to protect her from the dangers of internet fame. News outlets ran stories about the risks of platforms like OnlyFans, where creators often have to walk a fine line between engaging with their audience and maintaining their privacy. For Caitlin, that line had been crossed in the most horrific way possible. Her family, devastated by the loss, struggled to make sense of what had happened. John Blair, in particular, was racked with guilt. In the days following Caitlin's death, he replayed their last conversations over and over in his mind, wondering if there had been signs he had missed. Caitlin had mentioned feeling uneasy about some of her followers, but she had never seemed truly afraid. Like many young influencers, she had learned to brush off the constant barrage of comments, both good and bad, that came with her online presence. But none of them, not even Caitlin herself, had anticipated the danger lurking behind Mark Evans' screen. The investigation raised uncomfortable questions about the intersection of fame and security in the digital age. Caitlin had achieved success by sharing intimate parts of her life with the world, but in doing so, she had also opened herself up to those who would exploit that vulnerability. The balance between fame and privacy had been shattered, and the consequences were irreversible. For law enforcement, it became a case study in the growing threat of online stalking, a crime that too often goes unreported and unpunished until it's too late. As investigators dug deeper into Caitlin Blair's life, a more nuanced portrait of the young woman began to emerge. To the public, Caitlin had been an emblem of modern success, financially independent, beautiful, and constantly in the spotlight. But those closest to her knew that the reality of her life was far more complicated. Caitlin had built her career on social media, but the pressure to maintain that public image had taken a toll on her mental health long before Mark Evans entered the picture. Caitlin's rise to fame had been fast and at times overwhelming. She had started out as a dancer, performing at local venues and building a most following on platforms like Instagram and TikTok. When she transitioned to OnlyFans, her popularity skyrocketed, bringing in a significant income that allowed her to live a lifestyle she had only dreamed of. Yet with that success came an increasing sense of isolation. As her follower count grew, so did the distance between Caitlin and the people who had known her before the fame. She found herself withdrawing from her old friends, who couldn't relate to the pressures she faced in her new life. While Caitlin portrayed a confident and carefree persona online, in private she was struggling. The endless stream of comments, messages, and demands from her followers weighed heavily on her. She confided in her mother, Susan Blair, about feeling like she was always performing, always trying to meet the expectations of strangers. But she also felt trapped by the lifestyle her fame afforded her. The money was good, and the attention could be intoxicating, but it came at a price. As Caitlin's career grew, so did the number of people who felt entitled to her time and attention. The messages of adoration were often accompanied by darker, more insidious comments, threats, insults, and unsolicited advances. At first, Caitlin had brushed them off as part of the job, but over time, the constant barrage began to wear her down. She started to feel as though her life was no longer her own. Every post, every photo, every video was scrutinized by thousands of people, and she felt increasingly disconnected from the woman she used to be. That Caitlin first encountered Mark Evans. Like so many others, Evans had discovered her through her social media accounts and had become one of her most vocal followers. At first, his messages were no different from the hundreds of others she received: daily compliments on her appearance, admiration for her content. But as time went on, Evans' messages grew more personal and demanding. He seemed to believe that he knew Caitlin in a way that no one else did, and his fixation became more intense with each passing day. Caitlin tried to distance herself from the more obsessive followers, blocking accounts when necessary and limiting her interactions. But Evans was persistent. He created new profiles, finding ways to slip back into her digital world, his messages becoming increasingly unsettling. Caitlin confided in her friends that she was worried about him, but she still didn't believe that Evans posed a real threat. After all, he was just another faceless name behind a screen, someone who lived hundreds of miles away and whom she had never met in person. But in the weeks leading up to her murder, Caitlin's anxiety grew. She started to feel like she was being watched, even when she wasn't online. She became more cautious about sharing her location and stopped posting as frequently. Friends noticed that Caitlin seemed more withdrawn, but she assured them that she was just tired, that she needed a break from the constant grind of content creation. No one could have imagined how serious the threat really was. As the investigation into Caitlin Blair's murder deepened, one central question remained: How had Mark Evans' obsession spiraled into a deadly fixation? To answer this, detectives pored over every aspect of Evans' life, tracing the path that led him from a relatively quiet existence in Florida to committing a brutal murder in Texas. What they uncovered was a pattern of escalating behavior that, in hindsight, painted a clear picture of a man on the verge of losing control. Mark Evans had always been an introvert. Described by acquaintances as reserved and socially awkward, he had few close friends and kept mostly to himself. His co-workers at a local warehouse noted that he was often quiet, eating lunch alone and avoiding conversations unless necessary. But no one who knew him in passing could have predicted the level of obsession that would ultimately consume him. As it turned out, Evans' isolation extended far beyond the workplace. In the months leading up to Caitlin's murder, Evans had retreated almost entirely into the digital world. Social media became his only form of interaction, and it was there that he first encountered Caitlin. He had stumbled across her Instagram account in early 2021, instantly captivated by her photos and videos. To Evans, Caitlin wasn't just another online personality. She represented something deeper, a fantasy of beauty, confidence, and success that contrasted sharply with his own mundane and lonely life. At first, Evans was like any other follower, liking posts and leaving comments. But as Caitlin's content began to dominate his daily life, his attachment grew into something more sinister. His journal, recovered by police, revealed the depth of his infatuation. In page after page, Evans wrote about Caitlin as though they were already in a relationship. He referred to her as his muse, claiming that they were connected on a spiritual level, even though they had never spoken. Investigators also discovered that Evans had a history of failed relationships, each ending in bitterness and rejection. He had tried online dating, but his introverted nature and awkwardness made it difficult for him to form lasting connections. This only deepened his sense of isolation and resentment toward women, feelings that became intertwined with his growing obsession with Caitlin. In his mind, Caitlin represented the ideal woman, someone who was everything he believed he deserved but could never attain. And when she failed to respond to his messages, Evans' adoration began to turn into anger. By mid-2021, Evans was no longer content with simply following Caitlin online. He started researching her life, using the information she shared on social media to piece together details about her daily routine. He tracked her movements through her Instagram stories, noting when she went out with friends or traveled for work. It was then that Evans began planning his trip to Texas, convinced that a face-to-face meeting would finally make Caitlin understand that they were meant to be together. He quit his job, packed his car, and left Florida with no intention of returning. As Evans drove across state lines, his journal entries grew darker. He began to express frustration and anger, blaming Caitlin for not responding to his messages and accusing her of playing games with his emotions. The final entries, written just days before the murder, were filled with a chilling sense of inevitability. "She has no idea what's coming," Evans wrote, "but she will, soon." In retrospect, the signs of Evans' mental unraveling were glaring, but like so many other online stalkers, his behavior had gone unnoticed until it was too late. Caitlin, unaware of the extent of Evans' obsession, had simply blocked his accounts, assuming he would lose interest and move on like others before him. She had no way of knowing that Evans was already on his way to her doorstep, determined to make her a permanent part of his twisted reality. The events leading up to Caitlin Blair's final hours were pieced together through a combination of surveillance footage, phone records, and witness statements. On the night of August 28, 2021, Caitlin had been at home alone, taking a break from her hectic work schedule. She had spent the day posting new content to her OnlyFans account, followed by a quiet evening watching movies and responding to messages from friends. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She had no idea that Mark Evans was already in Fort Bend County, parked just blocks away from her apartment, waiting for the right moment to make his move. Evans had arrived in Texas earlier that week, staying in a motel a few miles from Caitlin's residence. He spent days observing her routine, learning when she left the apartment and when she returned. On the night of the 28th, he decided it was time. Armed with a knife he had purchased along the way, Evans approached Caitlin's apartment building. Told there were no signs of forced entry, leading investigators to believe that he had either convinced Caitlin to open the door or had followed someone else into the building. There were no signs of forced entry, leading investigators to believe that he had either convinced Caitlin to open the door or had followed someone else into the building. What happened next remains speculative, as there were no direct witnesses to the attack. However, the evidence suggests that once Evans was inside the apartment, he confronted Caitlin. Whether she recognized him from his online persona is unknown, but what is clear is that the situation quickly turned violent. Evans' obsession, once confined to the digital world, exploded into real-life horror. The living room bore the brunt of the struggle. Broken furniture, overturned chairs, and shattered glass told a story of desperation. Caitlin had fought for her life, sustaining numerous defensive wounds as she tried to fend off Evans. But he was relentless, fueled by months of pent-up rage and frustration. When it was over, Caitlin lay dead, her body beaten and stabbed multiple times. Evans, having accomplished his twisted goal, turned the knife on himself, ending his life next to the woman he had idolized and destroyed. Caitlin's neighbors, hearing the commotion, had called 911, but by the time emergency responders arrived, both Caitlin and Evans were dead. The apartment was eerily silent, the violence over as quickly as it had begun. Investigators were left to reconstruct the final moments of Caitlin's life, piecing together a tragedy that had been building for months in the darkest corners of the internet. The aftermath was devastating. Caitlin Blair's family was left shattered, grappling not only with the loss of their daughter but with the horrific nature of her death. Her father, John Blair, had discovered her body, a memory that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Friends and fans alike mourned her passing, struggling to understand how something like this could have happened to someone who had seemed so full of life and potential. For law enforcement, Caitlin's case became a stark reminder of the growing threat posed by online stalkers, particularly in the world of social media influencers and content creators. The line between fandom and obsession had been crossed in the most tragic way possible, and Caitlin Blair had paid the ultimate price. The aftermath of Caitlin Blair's death was a wave of grief and outrage that extended far beyond her immediate circle. Her murder struck a chord with the public, sparking widespread discussion about the dark side of internet fame and the dangers that lurked in the world of online influencers. Caitlin had been a vibrant, young woman living a life that so many admired from afar, but her tragic death exposed the risks that came with that visibility, risks that, until now, had gone largely ignored. In the weeks following the discovery of Caitlin's body, her family made it their mission to ensure her story would not fade into the background. John Blair, once a quiet and private man, became the face of a growing movement demanding better protection for individuals, particularly women living in the public eye. He gave interviews to major news outlets, his voice heavy with grief, urging both social media platforms and law enforcement agencies to take the issue of online stalking more seriously. Our daughter lived a life many would envy, but behind the screens and followers, she was vulnerable. Essatis Joe Mo, no one should have to fear their safety because they chose to share their lives online, John Blair said in one emotional interview. We lost her because no one saw the warning signs until it was too late. Caitlin's case became a catalyst for national conversations about privacy, security, and the increasing dangers faced by content creators. OnlyFans, Instagram, and other platforms where Caitlin had made her name came under fire for their failure to protect their users from harassment and stalking. Critics pointed out that while platforms encouraged creators to engage with their audiences, they often left them without adequate tools to defend themselves against the darker elements of the internet. In response to the growing public pressure, several of these platforms announced new measures aimed at enhancing user safety, including stricter monitoring of harassment and more robust reporting tools for creators experiencing unwanted attention. But for Caitlin's family, these changes came too late. The investigation into Mark Evans' actions brought no real closure. His death had effectively ended any chance of legal justice, leaving the Blair family with countless unanswered questions. Why had Evans' descent into violence gone unnoticed? Why had he not been flagged as a threat? Could something have been done to prevent the tragedy? These were questions that would haunt Quain's loved ones for years to come. In a bid to prevent similar tragedies, Caitlin's family launched a non-profit organization in her name, the Caitlin Blair Foundation for Online Safety. And the foundation's mission was clear: to raise awareness about the dangers of online harassment and stalking, and to advocate for stronger legal protections for internet personalities and content creators. John Blair became a vocal advocate for change, speaking at conferences and events, pushing lawmakers to introduce legislation that would make it easier to prosecute online stalkers before their obsessions could turn deadly. The foundation also provided resources for influencers and content creators, helping them navigate the complex and often overwhelming task of maintaining their online presence while protecting their privacy. Through this work, Caitlin's legacy became one of resilience and advocacy, a fight for justice not just for her, but for all those who lived under the constant threat of harassment.